Welcome to Tea with the Experts and Dr. Leah Merle, your premier destination for mental health insights, empowerment, and inspiration. Led by the passionate therapist and counselor educator, Dr. Leah Merle, this interview-style podcast delves deep into diverse themes with top-notch experts in the field. Beginning with the What Is series, from anxiety, trauma to resilience and mindfulness. We sip our way through captivating conversations, psychological insights, shedding light on the complexities of mental wellness and what it means to be a human being. Each episode serves up a refreshing blend of knowledge, empathy, and empowerment, aiming to destigmatize mental health issues and raise awareness in an engaging and approaching manner. So grab your favorite cuppa and get ready to step yourself into transformative conversations that will leave you feeling uplifted and enlightened. Subscribe now and join the movement to break down barriers and foster a more compassionate world.
Welcome back to Tea with the Experts and Dr. Leah Merle. This is the podcast series where we explore the depths of mental well-being, psychology, and the human experience. In today's special episode, we're going to continue our discussion with the extraordinary Dr. Dani Baker, who is a grief therapist and also an educator with over 20 years of experience helping individuals and families navigate the complexities of loss. So in part one, for those listeners that have followed us throughout this series, we covered some common misconceptions about grief and examined how truly Westernized cultures often encourage an emotional avoidance. So today we're going to dive even deeper, exploring primary, secondary, and tertiary losses, how grieving styles evolve over time, and also the critical role of meaning-making and continuing bonds in the grieving process. So this episode, part 2, is What is Grief in an Emotionally Avoidant Culture? And so, Dr. Dani, it is such a pleasure to have you back. Let's continue our meaningful conversation. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much, Dr. Merle. I'm so happy to be back. Thank you for having me again. It's wonderful to see you.
You too. It really, really is a pleasure.
So, without further ado, unless there's anything else you want to talk about, I'd love to just dive right in.
Let's do it.
We have a lot of territory to cover today. And so I'd love to just go ahead and get started.
Please do. Jump in. We're ready.
All righty. So before we dive into all of the amazing things that Dr. Merle just covered in the intro today, I think it's important for continuity and context to just maybe take a brief look back at the things that we discussed in part 1 of What is Grief in Emotionally Avoidant Culture. So here are the things that I'd like to cover today. First, there were some common misconceptions of grief, such as a common misconception is that grief is a linear or stage process rather than grief, which is often an ongoing journey that is experienced by moving back and forth along a continuum, or perhaps up and down a winding path, or maybe even in and out of a spiral. Another misconception is that if you are still actively grieving a significant loss after approximately 6 months, your grief may be pathologized and diagnosed as prolonged grief, anxiety, or depression. And while there is a place for all of those diagnoses, the average griever is actually just grieving. Rather than, and so what that means is natural grief, rather than being pathologized, natural grief is a long process that shifts and changes and is integrated over a period of time. If grievers are given the space and time and resources to mourn in ways that are supportive to them, they'll also find ways to navigate and adapt to their grief in healthy ways. Just like anything new, it takes time. And for most folks who experience significant loss, it takes some time. So I think it's important to just reiterate that piece. Additionally, we also explored how in some Westernized cultures, there's an unconscious bias toward avoiding emotions, or as Miriam Greenspan in her book, Healing Through the Dark Emotions refers to it, emotion phobia. This bias is informed by overt messages that productivity over resourcing and rest and renewal after significant loss is more important. So, in other words, if you're compromised emotionally, mentally, physically, spiritually by natural grief and working to process, integrate, and heal over a period of time longer than what society deems as appropriate, you're then seen as invaluable and or unhealthy. In other words, you should be over your grief by now and back to pre-loss functioning.
Oof, that really, really hits home. Thank you for revisiting part one. I think that's incredibly important regarding what is grief in an emotionally avoidant culture. I think the recap really just sets us up nicely to really think about discussing more, well, the depth of different types of losses that people experience, along with typical grieving styles.
Yes, perfectly said. So many folks, especially right after significant loss, tend to already have a natural grieving style or an approach that works best for them. And we typically in the grief world refer to these styles as either being an instrumental griever or an intuitive griever. And these styles were coined by Martin and Doka in the early 2000s. And what they found in their work regarding natural, healthy grieving styles was that folks either tended to process their grief from a thinking place or a feeling place. So, to help me remember each of these styles, I often refer to this as head and heart grievers. An instrumental griever or a head griever tends to be more task oriented, looking maybe for a framework or action steps to complete while grieving. While an intuitive or heart griever tends to explore their inner knowing and express or externalize their feelings when navigating. This perspective asks us to see grief along a continuum where instrumental is at one end of the continuum and intuitive the other. And over time, through awareness and adaptation, grievers want to work to incorporate both styles of grief in the hope of eventually moving towards the middle of that continuum as a healthy blended griever. So, again, initially in the beginning stages of significant loss, as we are learning to navigate our grief, we tend to lean to one side or the other of this continuum. And over time, if given the space to grieve in ways that speak to you, so if you happen to be an instrumental griever and you are interested in having more of a process, if you are provided or are able to find something that allows you to follow a framework or a process, it'll also help you to lean more fully into what is really, especially in the beginning weeks and months, very, very complicated and overwhelming. And vice versa. If you tend to be someone who is really more leans into their heart space, leans into a felt sense of what you might need, giving yourself opportunities to work from that perspective in the beginning weeks and months of grief is really important because as we get better and better at understanding what our styles are, it allows us then to be able to start that incorporation process where we start moving closer to the center. And eventually, over time, not right at the beginning, but over time, as we learn how to navigate our grief, we do find our way closer to a blended grieving style where we're pulling from both aspects.
Okay. So let's make sure that I've got this right so I'm on the right page. So, Dr. Dani, what you're saying is that most people who go through the grief process start as one or the other type of griever. But as healthy grief adaptation, most people kind of find their way to more of a blended type of grieving process where they use both their head and their heart to make meaning, let's say, and adapt to the loss that they've experienced.
Exactly. We definitely don't want to lean into binary or either or thinking in the context of grief. I think that, or I shouldn't say, I know that especially when we are compromised by grief, we're just really looking for anything that can help us. And so for a period of time, and when I'm talking with grieving folks about this, or when I'm teaching folks who are going to work with grieving folks, it's okay to be really at one end of the continuum or the other in the beginning. Really allowing folks to lean into what they're naturally drawn to and how they process things. So important. Eventually, we want to start introducing in what would be at the other end of that continuum to see if you can create more of a blended experience. Because being able to move from our head space to our heart space and back and forth in that way creates a natural level of integration that is so important as we move along our grief journey.
Mm, that makes total sense. And what about the type of loss? Does that impact or change one's grieving style?
I think that is a really great question. And I would have to say that at a baseline, as I previously mentioned, most people naturally integrate loss and change by their dominant grieving style, either their head or their heart space. And eventually that shifts because loss is so complex. Often we experience primary loss along with additional secondary and tertiary losses that follow. And so that also impacts our grieving style. And we're going to want to, any of us would naturally want to lean into what feels most supportive to us. So the type of loss doesn't necessarily impact what our natural style is, how we learn to process grief, and how we learn about what natural healthy grieving looks like. It allows us to then expand and adapt to maybe some additional things you might bring into the style of your grief. So, if we're looking at this idea of not just a primary loss, but also secondary and tertiary losses, what I'm saying is that when we're grieving, there is a primary loss, and this could look like the death of a loved one, impact of loss associated with chronic illness, ending of an important relationship or divorce, economic loss or economic insecurity, mental health or cognitive issues that impact navigating life, loss of country of origin or family or community due to immigration or separation, losses and losses across the lifespan, such as empty nesting, inability to have children, the impact on the brain and body of perimenopause, menopause, postmenopause, retirement or unforeseen changes in our professional identity, and physical or mental abilities that impact or take away our autonomy. So these are just a few of the lived experiences that produce significant loss. And as I previously mentioned, loss is multifaceted, and most folks also experience secondary and tertiary losses tied to that primary loss. So all of those things I just listed, which are huge, significant losses, you will also experience byproducts of those loss events. For example, let's say that a primary loss is the death of a parent in a child's life. And so a secondary loss might be that the family has to move due to financial constraints, now that this becomes a one income household. And a tertiary loss or a third loss could be that the family members lose their friends or support system, their community, their schools, local resources, etc. So you can see how one significant loss can create additional losses that also must be grieved, making the process of adapting and integrating loss very, very complex and ongoing over a long period of time.
Yeah.
So as I say all of this, Leah, I am curious. I'm wondering if you can think of any other type of primary loss that you've seen in your work and the secondary and tertiary losses as a result of that.
Yeah, definitely. I'm thinking about the work that I've done within the foster care system with youth in particular. And it's not necessarily a death loss, but it has been a primary loss for foster care kiddos. I've seen many foster care children be separated from their family through Child Protective Services. And so I would say that that would be the primary loss, right?
Yeah.
And then the secondary loss, sometimes it is moving away from their family system, moving into a different school system, moving into a different household. Sometimes it's in a different county as well. Well, and obviously in England it's county, but in this, them moving logistically and geographically, and that kind of falls into that tertiary loss, secondary or tertiary loss experience.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And so, such a great example, you can see the complexity of and the hardship associated with not just the primary loss, huge, 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 that example you gave, but then all of the other things that are byproducts of that loss that an individual or a family also misses out on. And when you're so, so compromised, as we talked about in part one of this podcast, what is grief, you can only imagine. You can only imagine how horribly difficult it is to navigate grief. So, so much there.
Mm-hmm. It's huge.
It's huge. In order for us to talk a little bit more in depth about how significantly complex this is, I will break down significant loss over an 18-month period, highlighting common experiences during specific time frames or windows of time and the coping strategies that are helpful during this fluid process of what Robert Niemeyer refers to as making meaning of grief. This means finding a way to integrate the past with the present and then obviously the future. Something that is driven by the brain and body as a way to assimilate to loss and also then adapt and integrate who you're becoming as you move forward. Dr. Mario Francis O'Connor's groundbreaking work regarding grief and the brain supports this fact. Her research shows that it can take our brain roughly 3 to 6 months to catch up with our body after significant loss. That's a really long time, 3 to 6 months. This information is so important and validates what I have seen in my years of working with grieving folks. With that in mind, I'd love to take a closer look at how navigating grief, moving in and out of these fluid periods of time after significant loss, and how multiple secondary and tertiary losses are often experienced for healthy grievers. So, to do this, I'm going to break these into time frames or windows of time. And I'm going to start with the first one, which is the first grief timeline or shouldn't say timeline, time frame or window is approximately 0 to 2 months. So as previously mentioned, the beginning after significant loss is difficult. The brain and body are trying to make sense of this primary loss as well as all of the additional losses. And essentially, our brain is on autopilot, which is a protective factor that the brain and body engages in order to survive early weeks and months of grief. Resourcing during this time is essential. And so remembering to take things hour by hour, keeping things very simple by doing our best to nourish our bodies and rest as much as we're able, as this time during the grieving process is so dysregulating and so disorienting and extremely exhausting. You're just not able to do a lot in this 0 to 2 month window. And so, really trusting what your body needs as best as you can in a time when you're very disoriented is hard to do. The second time frame or window is approximately 3 to 4 months. And during these time, things are less foggy or less disorienting as our brain begins to slowly adjust to this significant change. This is when many folks begin to experience moving forward and then taking steps back as they continue to make meaning of their loss and profound sorrow. So during this time, resourcing means you're still navigating life 1 hour to 1 day at a time. So very similar to the beginning months of grief. Still focusing on hydrating and nourishing your brain and body while finding ways to externalize your grief in short spurts, maybe by moving your body, talking with folks, crying, writing, and resting. At this point, most people are still experiencing aspects of feeling disoriented and exhaustion. So short moments of externalizing grief is often what it can really just the short amount of times is what can be tolerated. It's also important to only do the bare minimum during this time. So wherever people can cut back, allow others to help, or give themselves permission to do less in all aspects of life is key to navigating this window of grief, this window of time and this window of grief. And it's so important, and I share this with folks that I've worked with over the years. It's so important to remember that this period of doing less isn't forever. It's just for right now. People will eventually have the energy to take on more if they allow themselves the time and space to navigate their sorrow while establishing temporary yet supportive routines to help them get through this period of time. The third window of time is approximately months 5 to 6. And during these months, folks begin to have more mental clarity or focus and a better understanding of what supports help them while they're actively grieving, not just that primary loss, but also the subsequent secondary and tertiary losses. So short externalizing exercises become more routine as folks find a rhythm that helps them move in and out of their waves of grief. Resourcing during this time begins to take shape. Now that they are this many months into this process, grievers start to really know what feels most supportive to them during different aspects of their grief experience. Some people find talking and crying extremely, extremely helpful. Some find moving their bodies and taking multiple rests throughout a day helpful. Some start to feel like they have more energy, so they take on more tasks, but then might notice how their energy doesn't last as long as it used to. And so some are still experiencing, and some are also still experiencing heavy waves of grief. And it's extremely difficult to do much when those moments take place. It's also important to note that the 6 month mark after significant loss is a time when Westernized cultures expect grievers to complete their grieving process and get back to pre-loss functioning. And quite frankly, many, many grieving folks exhausted by their sorrow would really love a break too. It would be so nice to have a break from being sad, tired, lonely, frustrated, invalidated, angry, etc. Unfortunately, because meaning making is required to integrate loss, the natural grief process is a fluid experience, not driven by steps or stages. This means that it can take longer than 6 months of moving forward and backward along a continuum for our brains and bodies to not just adapt to loss, but integrate the loss in a way that informs how we've been changed by our experience, informs what we bring with us as we move forward, and informs how we begin to see who we're becoming as a result. As you might imagine, this is extremely hard and exhausting work. So, what this looks like in real time is some days, weeks, or months, we feel more strength and clarity. And then there are days, weeks, or months, it can seem as if we are back in the beginning weeks of grief. These are the steps moving forward and backward, a journey that takes much more than 6 months to not just make meaning of loss, but also to adapt to the significant changes that we're experiencing in our lives as we're trying to figure out who are we becoming through this profound, life-changing experience.
Overwhelming, the amount of information, right? But also the length of time that it takes to be able to kind of move forward through such a significant loss. And I think that it's such an important point because really, when we think about it, we've talked about this, Dani, a lot, but in North American societies that we utilize the DSM for a mental health diagnosis, and then people are still naturally compromised by healthy grief after, like you said that timeline, like 6 months, but they're commonly diagnosed with prolonged grief,
Yes.
right?
Yes, absolutely. And so it's one of the ways that grief illiteracy and emotion phobia are perpetuated in our world. If we avoid or pathologize natural grief, then we don't have to go through this long process to make meaning of our losses. However, my experience tells me after 20 years of working with grieving folks and what the science says about the grieving brain is it takes more than 6 months to integrate a significant loss event, especially, and this part is really key, especially if the 3 months after significant loss, our brain is not working at 100%. It's not 100% online due to the protective factors, the way our body and brain is designed, it actually protects us. It automatically engages after significant loss or traumatic experience to protect us from how hard it is to literally wrap our head around what has happened. So, this means that if most of us are really just starting to consciously, meaning less foggy brain, starting to come back online, if we're just starting to consciously make meaning of what has happened as we adapt to significant loss at 3 months into our grief journey, it tells us that we're really not at a place where we're actually able to start leaning into those adaptive grieving styles that we talked about. What does our head and our heart need? Those beginning weeks and months up to about month 4, those are you're just in survival mode. And so it's really at that time, around 4 months or so, that we start to have some intel, some data, some knowing about, are we more intuitive? Are we more instrumental? Are we more in our head? Are we more in our heart? And we keep things real simple. So we move into that 4 to 6 month period of time. We're starting to gather data, information, what and how we need to work as healthy grievers. And that brings us to our fourth time frame, which is approximately 7 to 10 months. And while we're not quite done grieving, most people during this time get a better find themselves they find themselves better understanding and knowing what they need to navigate their waves of grief. So researching is great during this time as well. Any type of researching, I'm all about it. Research what you need so that you know how to resource yourself. So oftentimes what I see in folks resourcing during this time means they're creating resources, something like maybe a bag of tools or a toolkit that is full of resources that they are starting to realize are helpful for them. And what they'll do is they might take this sort of resource over here and this sort of resource over here and put it together, tweak them a little bit as they continue to adapt to their loss. It's common to have a bit more energy during this period of time. And some might even think about taking on a new job or maybe traveling to see family or friends. The fifth window of time is months 11 through 13. And some grievers, after feeling good in the last few months, are surprised when they begin to feel more fatigued and their brain is a bit fuzzy. During this time, people report that they feel as if they are regressing in their grief journey. And in some ways, it feels as if or seems as if they're back at the beginning of their grief process. And they may, this in some ways, this is a little bit true. This is what trauma pioneer Bessel van der Kolk calls the body keeping the score. When folks get close to the anniversary of a significant loss, you're coming up on the 1-year mark, the 2-year mark, the 3-year mark since a significant loss event. Life or experiences can feel very familiar or similar to the time when the original loss occurred. And to be fair, many things do feel similar. Often the weather is similar, or events that happen during that time of year are occurring again. And it's very common for healthy grievers to think they're back at the beginning, and sometimes it's hard to convince them they're not. This is because the body and the brain remembers the past as if it's happening again today. That's why I've found it very helpful to introduce this potential occurrence around month 9 or 10 after loss. So if I'm working with someone and I've been lucky enough to work with them since the beginning of their loss event or shortly thereafter, and we're getting close. We're in that window of 7 to 8 months. And I will start to talk with them a little bit about, let's not create that this will happen, or we're not creating that this will happen. But if it does, let's make a plan to engage in extra resources and supports during this time, meaning as we get closer to that 1, 2, 3, 4-year mark, when we get into that anniversary time, let's make a plan for if you are starting to feel more activated in your grief, if it is starting to feel similar, even though you are this many months out, what can you do to maybe up your resourcing and supports game? Where is your toolkit? Let's bring that back out if it hasn't been in the forefront. So you know that you have things you can lean into that help support you. So that means resourcing during this time looks very planful, creating a lighter schedule, engaging in more self-care, strategizing about ways to remember their loved ones or honor their significant loss in important ways, such as really popular, a lot of times making a favorite meal, creating something symbolic like a picture or a collage, making a donation, planting a tree, building a memorial, taking time to process, honor, or grieve in a way that feels most supportive to them.
Yeah.
So finally, we get to the 14 to 18 month window of time. And we've moved past that anniversary period. And most often, people tend to get back on track, utilizing their strengths and resources, knowing what they need when they experience their waves of grief, while also beginning to branch out and lean into who they're becoming through this grief journey.
So let me get this right. The time frames are not linear, right? Of course. But what you're essentially saying is that many people's grief journey or adaptation and integration can last up to a year and a half, like 18 months or so.
Mhm.
Correct?
Mhm. Very correct.
Yeah.
Yes. And I just want to say, this is the basic time frame. Again, This is based on my experience of walking this journey with many, many healthy grievers, as well as what the scientific data substantiates about how our brains and body process and integrate loss.
Mm.
This takes somewhere within the time frame of 15 to 18 months. And like you said, it is not a linear process. So if you notice when I talk about these time frames, I have blocked them into months.
Yes.
And I want to really highlight that the way the numbers come together in terms of the months that you're in between 1 and 18 months can be different for everyone. But one of the things you'll notice as I went through those windows of time is that I talked a lot about how you are taking steps forward in your growth, right? And in your learning in terms of how you are adapting to being a healthy griever. And then sometimes you're taking steps back. And the taking the step back means you might be engaging in things that you had done earlier in your grief journey because at that time, whatever is coming up for you around your grief, those things you did prior are feeling more supportive for you right now than maybe what you were doing at that time.
Yeah.
So it's a dance of moving backward and forward that sometimes we're up here and we have so much more energy and more functioning. And some days it feels like we have to take these huge steps back.
Yeah.
It's important to highlight this because this is not a linear process. And we do have to take steps back because when we take steps back, what is actually happening is the integrative part that our brain needs in
Mm.
order to not just know that this has happened. We know it's happened, but also to solidify a knowing that both your brain and body understands in a way that allows you to incorporate and integrate and bring whatever you need to moving forward as you're continuing to navigate loss and becoming who you're becoming through this process.
Yeah. So instead of thinking of it as like a regression, right? It's more like you're saying it's more of a back and forward on the continuum, which helps you integrate the loss. And it's not linear and it takes a specific period of time, but it's loose dependent on the person. But then my brain goes to, okay, so then are we done? Are we done with grief then? After the 18 months, is that it? Can we move on?
We're all done. And in some Westernized societies, they like a very, succinct, very linear black and white process. So we know exactly what we need to do. We'll do it so that we can be done. And the reality is, and anyone who has experienced significant loss knows that there is an element of our grief that is always with us.
Yes.
What shifts and changes over time as we take these steps forward and back and learn how to navigate what life looks like after significant loss is a new way of being in the world. And part of that new way of being in the world means that when our grief is reactivated, because it does get reactivated, sometimes that comes in what are called waves, as we've talked about, you and I together and during our time during this podcast. Sometimes people talk about grief, really just kind of smacking them in the face, almost like a grief attack. They didn't even see it coming. Somebody will say something or you see something, and all of a sudden the bottom drops out and you are just free falling into a grief moment. And those things continue to happen over time. They get less and less and less as we learn more and more and more strategies to help us navigate our grief, as we hone what our grieving style is. Do I need more task-oriented things, more structured things to help me process this grief attack that I'm currently experiencing? Or do I need more intuitive heart space stuff to help me process this moment? Hopefully that makes sense. And I love how you talked about how you brought in the word regression because it feels like a regression. I can't tell you how many people will say to me, at that 10-ish month mark, it feels like that they'll start to have these grief attacks. They'll start to have these profound waves of grief that I haven't had for a while. And it does. It feels like we're taking a huge step back to the beginning and regressing, and all the intensely profound work that they have done. Where is it gone?
Absolutely. Wow. So, I mean, over this podcast, we've talked about the different types of losses, right? We've talked about the primary loss, the secondary loss, the tertiary loss. We've talked about the time frames. We've talked about this timeline. I know we talked about this in the first episode, but one of the analogies that I love is the tsunami analogy of the waves of grief and how they can just come out of nowhere and can really feel like they're taking you down. And then also, everybody is different. Everybody has a different type of grieving style. So I love the head and heart, right? That explanation of the ways and the mannerisms and maybe the process of how people grieve. I think that's really, really, really super important. Another thing that came up for me is just, when you were talking about those grief attacks that people
Mhm.
get, I think of when you see something, right? And it brings the emotion up, or it brings a memory up. Sometimes what I've noticed is smells as well, like when the senses are activated, and that's where kind of that mind and body connection is really activated when the brain is not online, but maybe there's a somatic element to the integration of the grief too. So those were, I know we're wrapping up potentially at this point, but really those are profound sections of what people go through.
Yeah, and I really appreciate that you brought that piece in, the sensory piece, because one thing that's very, very common that I've experienced over and over again with natural healthy grievers is, as I'll preface again by saying, we're not going to create that this tsunami or this wave of grief is going to happen as we move closer to this anniversary time. And if you start to feel things shifting, let's have a plan in place, right, to take care of yourself. One of the things that they'll say, as if that starts happening for them, is the sensory piece. They'll talk about the weather, and they'll talk about how there's just something about, I noticed that the weather was this today. And then I'll say to them, and I don't know what it is, but something about that. And I'll say to them, do you remember back during this time, a year ago or a few years ago? Was that something that was also this type of weather occurring at that point? And again, it's this experience of that sensory experience. You're noticing the things we always notice. If we live in a place where we have seasons, we notice the shifts in seasons, but it becomes very pronounced when something like that is tied to a significant loss event and can activate our grief experiences, right? Can activate waves of grief.
Yes. Yeah. Beautifully said. Beautifully said.
And I would be remiss if I didn't add one last thing as we wrap up here, Leah. Anyone who experiences loss of any kind knows, as we've been talking about, they must go through their own process or their own journey to make meaning and adapt and integrate their personal grief experiences. And that could be, again, I think it's really important to highlight, we're not just talking about our loved ones, maybe that have died. We're also talking about animals. We're talking about places. We're talking about our identities. We're talking about the things that are important to us that we lose across the lifespan. And what's really important to remember is, and this is what Dennis Class refers to as continuing bonds, the love that we have for those things never, ever dies. We are always connected forever by our love or our memories, which are both a comfort as well as a reminder of our loss. And over time, when we engage in this continuing bonds experience, the pain lessens, but the remembering or the connection remains. And so I always say to folks, whatever you had with that experience with that person is yours forever. That does not die with them or that experience. So I think it's just so important to make sure that people are aware of this concept of continuing bonds. Sometimes I'll hear folks talk about how they don't know that that is a healthy approach to stay connected to our person, our people, our things, our places, our identities, our all the stuff that we go through. Because if you recall at the very beginning in our the first podcast, part one, I talk about change equals loss equals transformation. So any aspect of loss, we are always connected to whatever it is that is no longer with us in whatever way that is. And eventually, when people can lean into that, it becomes very, very soothing to those, wounded or broken hearts when they are in the depths of, profound sorrow.
Yeah. The continuing bonds research and work, I know we've discussed this before. Dennis Class, right? Dennis Class. It's profound. It's so profound and also adaptive. I think about like maladaptive and adaptive, so healthy and unhealthy things. It's a real healthy kind of adaptation, right? Of continuing to have that talk with the individual that's gone, or continuing to have those memories. There's a book that I read with kids called The Invisible String.
Yes, love that
Have
book.
you read that book?
Yes.
So much. And it's this exactly. That continuing bond, right? It doesn't have to be there in person. You don't have to see it. It's within you. Like it's a part of your experience with that person or thing. And it continues. It continues.
Yes, all the things, all the love, all the beautiful memories, they stay with you. They are yours. No one can take that. It is not meant as a substitute for, not physically having our people with us or having, that animal or that place that we no longer have access to or anything else that we're navigating around loss. And yet, it is in the remembering where we do our grief work. And so when you look at some of the things we've talked about, and this is a really great way to wrap up this part two, tying these things together, when you look at our grieving styles and what feels most resonant for us, are we moving, do we lean more to, our head or our heart, especially in those beginning months of grief, leaning into what makes sense to us in a time frame where nothing makes sense. So what I'm saying, leaning into meaning reconstruction, Robert Nehemiah, which the shorthand of that is meaning making. So how do we take our style, the way we grieve, and we continue to use that to help us make meaning? While we're making meaning, we also get to stay connected through continuing bonds to our people, places, animals, things, aspects of us that are still ours, even after loss. And it's this perfect trifecta of a framework or a holding, something that holds us as we navigate such a really, really, really tough time for so many folks.
Yeah.
And so, on that note, I'd love to refer y'all that are listening to the resources regarding supports and information for people in the first 18 plus months of grief after significant loss, which can be found in the info section of the podcast description. And last, but definitely not least, please, please, please remember that anything that I offer, only take what resonates for you and your lived experience and leave the rest behind. I do not know everything. I have my own lived experience around grief. I have been so fortunate to work with so many grievers that have taught me a lot of things. And the most important thing is we are all different and we all do our grief work different. So please take this information as it was intended, to be helpful, and whatever does not feel helpful, leave it behind.
Absolutely. Agreed. What a beautiful note to kind of close on, Dani. And so thank you for joining us for part 2 of What is Grief in an Emotionally Avoidant Culture. And really, just listeners, thank you for being here, but also a heartfelt thank you to you, Dr. Dani Baker, for sharing your invaluable experience, your expertise, your insight on this profound yet hard topic to talk about. So we really hope that today's conversation has shed some light for you on the multifaceted nature of grief. And we hope that it's offered you practical strategies for embracing and navigating your own personal journey, or even supporting others who are maneuvering and kind of traversing their own experience. So if you found value in this episode, please share it with your friends, your family, or anybody who might benefit from these discussions. And again, it's a 3-part series. This is part 2. Part 1 is the basic integration and understanding of grief. So don't forget to subscribe to Tea with the Experts and Dr. Leah Merle for more engaging and thought-provoking episodes. So until next time, take care of yourself and each other. And remember that the healing process and growth really happens at your own pace. So please be kind to yourself in the process. Don't forget to subscribe. Bye for now.